Travel season is almost here, and that means students will be spring breaking it all over the globe. Young Canadian travelers and others around the world will be soaking up the sun in places like Mexico and Cuba, destinations where the parties are constant and the scene is always lively. Canada, however, will be playing host to an older, more quieter crowd. It seems that Canada's picturesque landscapes just aren't enough of a draw for young travelers to cross our borders. Statistics from the Canadian Tourism Commission show that our true north will, instead, play host to retired trekkers over 55 years old who are well educated with a high income. I have here with me fellow Glue reporters Brooke Timpson and Megan Sylvester, both whom are experienced in and have a love for travel.
Hi, Dani.
Hey, Dani.
Perfect, so I guess let's get right into it, guys. So first of all, what is it about Canada that fails to attract younger international travelers?
As mentioned on the Canadian Tourism Commission, the top travel months in Canada are the summer months, July and August. So unless you're drawn to Canada during the winter months for outdoor sports, it sort of has an international reputation for being quite unpleasant. For example, I was reading tips on travelpodcast2, which is a popular website for travelers. The How to Drive in the Canadian Winter Guide actually warns travelers to, quote, assume the worst. So again, it's taken quote for quote on a very popular travel website that people internationally will be looking at. And it's just one example of Canada's international reputation for being cold and miserable at times, which is not very enticing.
And just to expand on that as well, just places where we see most international travelers come from, which are Australia, Brazil, China, France, and Germany, they're all warm climate areas. And our snow and cold weather just doesn't appeal to that type of traveler, I would think.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to look at those stats. Australians being one of the highest population to visit Canada. Interesting that a lot of Canadians also travel to Australia. So Australians wanting to come and try skiing at Whistler. It's just that flip-flop. Canadians want to go and experience Bondi Beach. So I guess the grass is always greener on the other side.
And I would just say, too, I think we have to look at the where exactly Canada's hoping to pull its tourists and see, we always welcome visitors from, around the world, including Europe and those countries. But if you look into a bit of the research that the Canadian Tourism Commission has also been conducting, you can see that they've spent a lot of their efforts in the last short months focusing on emerging markets and opportunities. So I know that the CTC has been doing some work on trade shows in places like India, trying to encourage visitors from there, trying to encourage, other sources of visitors. So we have to also consider what exactly the government's focusing on, and that might help explain why some of the numbers might fluctuate a bit, depending on where we're focusing our effort.
Sure, but on the other side too, for me as a young traveler, there's nothing here for young adults to do. It's not interesting to me to travel within my own backyard, and I know we'll get into that a little bit later, but Canada is known for its scenery and not necessarily for our entertainment.
I think too, just speaking on Canada's brand on the international front, I met a backpacker from Germany. He's a 24-year-old student. He's backpacking through the U.S. and Canada over 6 months, and he mentioned as a backpacker, he got all of the things he expected from Canada. Nature, wildlife, friendly people. He went to his first NHL game. He even experienced his first Thanksgiving. But I think unless you're interested in that specific niche, like outdoors, wildlife, it's not really your forte, I guess. There's one brand.
I also have to mention too that there were several global tourism watch reports from countries like Australia, and they reported that the second most cited barrier keeping them from traveling to Canada was a preference to really just travel to other countries. They also say that they're unaware of vacation opportunities in Canada, and we also came in dead last for travelers wanting to experience our historical and cultural attractions as well as local cuisine. I mean, you can get poutine anywhere else in the world. It's just a horse by another name.
Yeah, I totally agree. In terms of traveling within the country and outside, for cost, it just seems to be much cheaper to go on a vacation to Cuba or Mexico for $700 than buying a 13-day train odyssey across the country, which could cost between $4,000 and $5,000. So that's pretty hefty. Why would you do that when you can go get a tan for $800?
Yeah, and of course, and when we're keeping the focus and the scope of our discussion on young people, obviously the interests of a person of that typical age. I know we're not all the same, but Danny's right. A lot of people kind of look to go for specific parties and things. We also have to consider, as we brought up as well earlier, the money that is associated with it. So, I mean, I wouldn't see it as a huge problem that perhaps there isn't as much of an interest to travel in Canada. I think it's unfortunate because it's a great country. But I mean, you can also blame the 23-year-old Australian who's on a reading week, that, obviously coming to visit Regina is not like going to Zagreb and going, or to Split and going to a beach or something. So it's two different apples and oranges we're comparing, and I think the age is really just the preventative that kind of hinders the experience at some. But there are other things like so many international conferences and just going to semester in Canada or abroad. There are other options like that I think we shouldn't forget that young people do consider. So just because maybe they're not coming to Toronto for 4 days doesn't mean that they're not interested in applying to U of T and staying for 5 months. So
good point.
We can definitely be seen as an expensive place to visit. But again, being young and not having an amazing income, I don't think that's the problem. I think the problem is that people don't feel like they're getting the most bang out of their buck. So it's the question of cost versus worth. So do you think Canada is actually as expensive as it seems, or is it just not worth coming here?
I think it is as expensive as it seems. Net mentioned Max, as I was speaking earlier, the backpacker. I mean, just buying little things like beer, for instance, in Germany, that would cost 50 cents at your local grocery store. Here, you might pay $10 for a not so decent bottle of wine. And backpacking through Europe, when I was there, we found hostels for as low as €9 a night. Hostels range anywhere between $20 to $100 here, depending on the type of room. And if you're looking to book a hotel, it's anywhere between $60 a night to $200. So, and I mean, again, taking the train could cost between $4,000 and $5,000. And let's not even get into flying, because in Europe you can take flights within the EU for as low as €13. I did, going from Barcelona to Greece. Meanwhile, traveling across Canada, it could cost you anywhere between $700 and $800. I think it is fairly expensive.
Yeah, and of course, and those are things that that tourism is obviously affected by. We do have to look at costs and flights and stuff like that, and it's a factor that definitely that affects all of us.
But in terms of the worth, I don't think it's worth it. I feel like I'm going to get more of an experience elsewhere in the world. It's no secret that I love traveling to New York City, and that place can be expensive, and probably more expensive than traveling in Canada. But I also think I'm going to get more of that traveling experience and those memories in one small island hosting so many millions of people a day than I am here in the capital of Canada, Ottawa, because honestly, I don't think there is anything you could do for a week that will keep you occupied in the capital. And I think that's sad, because we're supposed to be on the map.
I think it's hard too, because when you're traveling in Europe, you can, obviously Canada is a large space. It's one of the biggest countries in the world geographically, so you can't just go from Toronto to Vancouver if you're spending a week in Canada. In Europe, you can take the overnight train and go from Berlin to Paris. So you can do a lot more with your time.
And I was just going to say too, continents and specifically, I guess, countries are sort of brushed with their strokes of what they have to offer, and it might be a bit superficial. Of course, it can get into nitty-gritties, but we look at Europe, and yes, that's for Canadians our choice to go travel. We study our whole lives, where we come from and our history, and that's connected to elsewhere in the world. So we can look at Europe like that and as that place to sort of visit, and we have to also consider how Canada is seen. And we've sort of discussed, yes, it might not be seen as the most bustle kind of place, but not everyone goes and travels and wants to look at the Louis Vuitton store. So I think we have to consider that and why our visitors are a little bit older when they come here. And
then in terms of Canadians traveling within Canada, so domestic travel, Canada isn't even attracting Canadians of any age, really. So Canada's top 5 destinations, according to Statistics Canada, are the US, UK, Mexico, Cuba, and the Dominican Republic. Now, the October 2013 Canadian Tourism Commission Tourism Snapshot Report says that outbound trips by Canadians increased by 2.1% in the first 10 months of 2013. They also say that international travelers spend an average of $1,400 on a trip to Canada, while Canadians spend less than $300 traveling domestically. These numbers show that Canadians are less interested in traveling within their borders and would rather go elsewhere. So how is it that we even fail to attract fellow Canadians to travel within Canada?
Well, when you mention countries like Cuba and Mexico, I would think of package tours. That's normally what people buy when they travel there. So I was looking up package tours for Canada on tours.com, and some of those, like an 8-day trip in just Ontario and Quebec alone, is about $1,300. So, I mean, it's much cheaper to go on a vacation down south than it is just to travel in our own backyards.
For sure. I think it's the cost, it's the economy that's been sort of fluctuating. You know, people are a little more nervous to travel when you know, you're not 100% sure about savings and things like that.
But then I think too, I'm going to go a whole other way and just say I'm not interested in traveling in Canada, just on the pure basis that I don't think this country has anything to offer me as a tourist. I think I would be more like, if I was to go to the Rockies, yeah, it's beautiful. I'm sure I could be wrong, and I'm sure I'll hear about this. But seeing the Rockies, yes, it would be nice, but I feel like I would be the penguins in Madagascar once they get to Antarctica and be like, now what? You know?
Yeah, I think you can argue a little bit of that too, is just sometimes we always think the grass is greener on the other side. I'm sure there's people that live in like Lyon, France, that could, you know, care less about visiting Paris or going to like Marseille for their summer vacation, and those are beautiful places that we all go over. But when you live there, at times you tend to take those things for granted. And yes, I'm not at all comparing, you know, our little beaches, you know, Mooney's Bay in Ottawa to, you know, the south of France. But having said that, I mean, like I said, I think sometimes we can look over a little bit of what we do have. When you say you're from Canada, like, a lot of people still respect that and know where you're from and know your history and want to take interest in visiting, just as we do when we meet someone from somewhere else. So
I guess it's just about Canada representing itself differently, different niches, as opposed to just the nature, wildlife of the Rockies and out west. I think it has a lot of rebranding to do on the international front to draw more people
for
here.
sure. But I think I think we can still look at some of the successes in our branding as, yes, maybe not your first idea to go to a different province for spring break or whatever, but you know, I think internationally and domestically, we have people look at Canada as, I can move here and work here and have a career here. There are still lots of successes that we have that might not necessarily translate into the traditional young tourist vacation
mode.
Right?
But at the same time, you have the Vancouver Olympics, where we had a chance to show the world who Canada was, right? But then they chose to only really represent two groups within Canada, and Canada is multicultural and multifaceted. And I understand we can't represent everybody within that couple of hours of opening. Reassuring everybody that their stereotypes of us are really right. You know, we are poutine, we love to say A, we're French, and
Michael Blueblade loves dancing on beavers' hats, yes.
Yeah. Absolutely. Well, great. That's all the time we have today. I'd like to thank both Brooke and Maggie for joining. Now, whether you agree or disagree with Brooke, Maggie, or myself, we would love to hear what you have to say, so please leave us a comment below. This is Dani-Elle for Glue.